Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 12. Farewell to Ligerium. Varus was called the sun-tide seat of the Ligerian king ever since its foundation after the War of Annihilation. Vindar wanted a place of beauty and repose, away from Arwis and the dark memories of the Great Swarm. A sweeping bay with good anchorage at one end, 38 miles north of the capital, suited well for this purpose. Over the centuries, a thriving city developed here, with most of its dwellings constructed outside the wall built by that cautious monarch. The second wall, not as imposing as the first, eventually sprang up to envelop the harbor, new market district, and the summer houses of influential courtiers. Even with such adequate defenses, the port city almost fell to marauding swarmlings. Bereft by Turik of most of the garrison, as well as scores of able-bodied volunteers, Varus was saved only by the contribution of the sailors from the small Ligerian war fleet lying at anchor in the bay, and the energetic defense mounted by the Duke of Pernacum, who happened to be at his villa on the outskirts. The swarm in this corner of the land had also lost its cohesion by then, breaking up into smaller bands that went after livestock on farms rather than people in walled fortresses. The soldiers and citizens of Varus beat off 2 ferocious assaults, during which there was fighting in the very streets, and they suffered heavy casualties. They gritted their teeth and waited for the final one to finish them off. It never came. 2 tense days passed, with people flocking to the largely ornamental temples to implore Imran for their deliverance. The god of battles seemed to hear them, for scouts creeping out of the beleaguered city on the 3rd day reported no sign of swarmlings outside. Those safely within the walls celebrated their unlikely salvation. Nevertheless, more than half the people of the city had perished. Moreover, there were still bands of marauders in the countryside, and unless the farm produce could be secured and brought within the walls, the remainder faced starvation. Once again it seemed that the fleet would come to the rescue. Protected by the wall, men could venture out in the galleys, land in force further down the coast, and retrieve such supplies as they could discover. There was great excitement, too, when sails were sighted on the horizon that same day. A large sea raven fleet arrived on the tide, and for once the people of Ligerium blessed their enemies from the isles. Surely the worst was over, now that so many armed men had come to their aid. It was only when they witnessed the boarding of their 4 proud galleys and the slaughter of the guards that their cries of welcome turned to dismay. The new Sea Raven lord named Zebar lost no time in issuing an ultimatum to the stricken city. The lives of all the people would be spared only if they surrendered unconditionally and immediately. They would receive rations and safe passage to Trax Isles. There they could enter service or be sold back to the mainland if the new rulers wanted them. The Duke and several other dignitaries balked at being taken as slaves, but there was really no choice in the end. They could not escape the city with the swarmlings still at large outside the walls and the despicable pirates blockading the sea. Their nightmare was far from over. Thus they had to look on from the overcrowded deck pages on the slaver ships as their city was plundered and partially burned. What one enemy could not accomplish, the second had. Tregoran scouts arrived the day after the Sea Raven fleet had departed. They entered the unguarded city with great care, expecting stray swarmlings still lingering here. The evidence of burning everywhere was puzzling, though. This was not something the swarm would do. Perhaps the desperate people had set fire to their own city in an effort to deter the monsters. Soon they saw movement among the smoking ruins. Bedraggled survivors crawled out of hiding places like they had in other stricken cities throughout the land. Their tale of woe confirmed the worst suspicions. Ligerium remembered why it hated the vulturine pirates of the Isles so vehemently. There was a glimmer of hope for them when they were told of the survival of the old king and that he was close by. The scouts urged them to stay in their hideouts till Tregoran's group arrived. Venturing out in the open would only invite further disaster to befall them. Still in Aris down the coast, Haldred felt the overwhelming sadness gradually gain a hold over her. She was suffocating in this dead city, with its silent streets, the gaping doorways of abandoned houses, the forlorn keening of the sea breeze through empty markets and the tall arena. This place had been so full of life and business, the very heart of her country, the primary city of the realm. Now it was good for no one but marauding seagulls and ravens. The refugees had settled in the palace itself. Even this place of exclusivity and grandeur no longer had any relevance. She even slept in the very room she had inhabited with Julos, remembering the tears of shame, the harsh words, the agony of shattered illusions. All those events, all that distress seemed far away, as if it happened to someone else, the girl she had been in another life. Julos was gone, just a bad memory now. Ligerium had disappeared. Vengus was dead. Her parents were broken reeds, forever mourning the losses they could not comprehend. All this grief grew heavy in this place, unbearable. She had to get out of Aris, out of Ligerium, to a place where there was life and laughter still. Pining away for a life that was irrevocably lost would rob her of what remained of her sanity. She stared out of the high palace window as dusk settled on the tomb-like city. There were no lights flickering on in the staring windows, no sounds of laughter or merriment floating on the evening breeze from the docks. All around was death and desolation. She caught her breath. That her youthful dreams would end like this, drowned in seas of blood and violence. After all they had suffered to accomplish in that cavern, it had all been for naught. Her home was gone, her people destroyed. Raw, painful sobs shook her frame. Her body could not hold adequate air to vent her grief, and she kept gasping, floundering. It seemed as if the sorrow would tear her apart to find its expression. Arid's frightened face appeared in the door, but she did not notice him. Nothing mattered but the gaping hole where her soul used to be. She was weeping for the thousands, small and great, who had not the opportunity. The multitudes trampled, whether they were good or evil at heart. She wept for the faces in the tent city, those grateful eyes that thanked her without words for kindness shown, for the running, screaming woman overtaken in the desert sands by numberless messengers of death, for her poor brother whose message of truth could not be received. Yes, and even for faithless Julos, who would not want her forgiveness, and had died before her eyes. The boy at the door fled to find help. Something terrible was happening to his mother. Gira came running at his cries of distress. She found her mistress kneeling by the window, the shadows of night stealing over her shaking form. She stopped at this disturbing sight, uncertain.
Princess Hildred, what is the matter?
There was no reply but the rasping breath and tearing sobs.
Princess, are you hurt?
Kira knelt down next to the woman, wringing her hands.
Princess Hildred, what can I do? What is the matter? Do not call me that.
The drowned voice was near hysterical.
I am not, no longer.
Kira put her arms round the trembling shoulders. She was not pushed away. For a few moments she sat in silence, absorbing the unbridled outburst of emotion. Then she spoke, slowly and soothingly.
You are Princess Haldred. To me and Maris, and everyone out there, you are different from all the women I saw in Ekan's house. The only one who had a heart that was beautiful, and not a body only. I admired you so much. I was so glad they gave me to you. Your father was the king, but that did not make you a princess. It is what you are, and will always be, even when all the kingdoms are dust.
The sobs were subsiding. The frantic breathing slowed. Haldred was actually listening to her, or was she merely growing exhausted? Kira patted her shoulder.
You are tired. It has been a long and trying journey. Please let me help you to bed. It will be better if you can sleep.
The weeping woman did not respond, but there was no resistance as Kira helped her up and steered her towards the bed.
Please, lie down for a moment. I will fetch water for your wash.
Haldred obeyed mechanically, like a little girl worn out beyond protest. Kira slipped out quickly. When she returned with a basin of water and Maris in attendance with a lamp, Haldred was fast asleep. She placed the basin on the bed, took the lamp, and dismissed the man. There were nightgowns in the closet. Carefully, so as not to wake her, she washed the poor woman's feet, hands, and face, and changed her clothes. She fetched the blanket from the adjoining servant's room and spread it over the quiet form. When Haldred woke, she saw the tear-stained face of her mother. Rewen gave a cry when she opened her eyes and pressed a little handkerchief to her mouth. Her voice was muffled by it.
Oh, girl, you gave us a fright. Your father and I could not bear to lose you also.
Haldred found her tongue slow and heavy, as if she had taken a strong sedative potion.
Lose? Me?
Rewen lowered the handkerchief and her voice became clearer.
You have not woken these 2 days and nights. I feared you never would.
It was a warm feeling, this concern from a mother who had ignored her most of her life. Was it real, or just a result of the tremendous guilt she and her husband bore? Haldred reproached herself immediately for such a wicked thought, but it lingered without permission, clouding her mind. Having heard the voices, Kira came into the room smiling. At her appearance, the gloomy thought fled, to be replaced by shame. A memory of the girl comforting her in her distress came to the fore.
Princess Haldred, I'm glad to see you are awake. Would you like to have some supper?
Yes, she would, she thought, feeling weak with hunger, but she merely nodded in reply, unable to meet the girl's eyes. Her mother took her leave to let her eat in peace. It was a fine meal, better than she had had for many a 10-day. Yet she soon had her fill, the sudden appetite leaving abruptly. Kira smiled and twittered round her like a little bird. It would have been amusing had her emotions not been turned to lead. One more visitor came that evening. Captain Melvor appeared in the doorway, a frown of concern on his face. The sight of him brought tears to her eyes. He apologized immediately.
I'm sorry. I did not want to distress you.
Please, don't leave.
She felt a sudden longing for the support of this man's unrelenting strength. He nodded slowly, his eyes measuring her condition.
I will stay a few moments.
He came forward and seated himself on a stool by her bedside. Rewen probably used the same one for her vigil.
I do not wish to trouble you with news, but 2 of our scouts came in this afternoon from Veyris. Would you want to hear the report?
She nodded apprehensively, fear flaring up inside her unresisting mind.
The city suffered a similar fate to that of Aruis, with a few important differences. It was sacked by the sea ravens also, but unlike this place, it managed to beat off the swarm. Thousands survived and were taken to the Isles as slaves.
Haldred gasped in dismay.
It has all been for nothing then. It would have been better to perish in Breck.
He shook his head, frowning.
Once the swarm is eradicated, these captives may be rescued or ransomed. They are still alive, and Ligerium with them. Surely this is good news.
Good news. Haldred tried to understand what was told her, but the heaviness did not retreat. She forced a smile.
I suppose it could have been worse.
Her words lacked conviction. Malvor noticed it too, but did not remark on it. He returned the smile instead.
I will leave you to your rest.
Aldred was left alone again, wondering why the visit and the words of encouragement had brought no comfort to her. She felt better in the morning. Kira helped her wash and dress in an emerald gown that she had been loath to leave behind in the city on her previous departure. She marveled that such a bauble could influence her state of mind. Was she really as vain and shallow as the shocking outcome suggested? She busied herself with the preparations for departure. Already they had lingered too long in the city, still within reach of Hecan's marauders. It would be safer further up the coast in Varys, which had so clearly been earmarked for the Sea Raven lords. Though Malvor's scouts reported no activity west of Daraco yet, the desert bandits' men could move swiftly once they sensed the prey within their reach. Aldred noticed the curious and certainly sympathetic stares from all she encountered. Rumors had to be circulating about her. She was assailed with irrational suspicions and speculation. Instead of drawing comfort from her fellow sufferers, she was irritated by their interest. Aerith kept his distance too, stealing anxious glances at her. For the first time in her life, she found his presence and need of her a burden too great to tolerate. To her relief, Maris must have noticed something of her distress and kept the boy occupied away from his mother. All morning she kept unpacking and repacking the few items of clothing she could afford to take with her. It became an obsession to select the best suited, while not leaving behind anything beautiful for the filthy slavers to pilfer. Kira eventually walked in on her, weeping over her pathetic bundle, clutching an unpractical white festival gown she had certainly outgrown. Fearing a relapse, the girl distracted her with the midday meal and whisked away the offending garment while she was occupied. A soldier arrived soon after to inform her that the column was about to form up for departure. The summons seemed to simplify her situation. She was able to put all other matters out of her thoughts. The bundle was ready and would have to do the way it was. She quickly finished what remained of her meal, picked it up, and without as much as a backward glance, walked from the room. The people in the main courtyard, all stealing concerned glances at her, was a surprisingly reassuring sight. Here was a tangible reason for pressing on. A mixture of race and cultures, from different cities, towns, and countries, the remnants of the old world who pleaded with her for support and direction. She would not abandon them for the sake of her own grief. Malvor was at the head of the column again, his scarlet Nurian surcoat like an ensign of encouragement. Asar was there too, as was the royal pair in their unpretentious walking attire, giving her a nod and a smile as she joined the leading group. Maris became her shadow, and Kira fussed over any little thing that could cause her discomfort. Aldred found she could now muster a smile for these ministrations that brought on more annoyance than it alleviated. They left the dead city behind, another monument to the ravages of the swarm. 3 days would bring them to the last outpost of the Ligerian realm. Already they knew that it too had been compromised. 2 days of rest and sufficient food had restored the entire company. They made good time up the coastal way, always in sight of the sea, and nervously watching for any signs of their oppressors from Track's Isles to put in an appearance. It would not take long for their newfound resolution to be tried. Hunnick shook his head in disbelief. Around him a sea of Aeronite pavilions and campaign tents covered the plain. The host was gathering at Bryn's Keep from the corners of the realm to answer the call of their king once more. Contingents that arrived from the furthest reaches and were too late for the great battles against the Gudrid invasion now eagerly joined the veterans. Further demands were made on the city garrisons and noble households to replace the losses of that epic struggle. Ranald determined to field no fewer than 40,000 men, excluding the forces that would keep an eye on the south and the barbarian prisoners. It was not this impressive array that had prompted the Viron's incredulity. His gaze was fixed on Lord Gale, the shock of what the latter was revealing to them clearly written on his face. With him stood the other Viron of Heron Inrath, similar expressions decorating their features. Even Beor, known for his reserve, was flushed with excitement.
I can scarce credit such a number.
It was Hunnick's voice speaking for all of them. Gale merely smiled. He felt still that same sense of wonder at the sight in the portal veil.
I have it straight from the leaders. 7,712. And I saw them for myself, filing past in their rags, and with their rusty weapons taken from their oppressors.
Do you mean to say that Thorin had them taken down to that forest hell hundreds of cycles ago? Beor interrupted. The old man nodded.
Long before the summoning, perhaps when the tour was first driven into Terrallon.
There were low whistles and expressions of dismay. Tyro was the first to speak.
That demon has tortured and dishonored our people for 2,000 cycles, and no one ever knew.
Gale's smile was sad, almost a grimace of pain.
He knows the art of deceit. While he sat with us round the table and discussed the affairs of the realm, while we planned together and built together, he had that terrible secret to laugh about behind our backs. Not even the Sear could penetrate the mists of the Thankwood.
Hunnick shook his head again, as if he could not accept what he knew to be the truth.
Then this is a miracle. With no help from outside, these wretches escaped the Shadow's prisons and have come home to us. But do they know how desperate things are in the north? Do they intend to hide in the towers in the hope that he will be defeated?
I know not what they intend. There is little they could do to help. It is best that Vir keeps them out of harm's way. Perhaps he has a place where they could flee and be safe from Malik's revenge. But, as you said, it is a miracle, and a heart-warming sight to see so many who are not tainted with a Nurian curse of willful ignorance. He turned away abruptly as a messenger from the king approached. To everyone's dismay, the man bowed almost to the ground.
King Ranald requests your presence in his quarters, my lords. Please follow me.
The Viron exchanged bemused looks. They would be the first of their kind, they believed, to see the inside of Bryn's Keep in a very long time. One by one they filed after the messenger towards the fortress gate. The Inrathian encampment was just to the north of the old structure, not far from the entrance. As they walked, Tyro, his head still buzzing with the incredible tidings, whispered to Hunnick.
What a pity we have no time before we set out for Belroot. There must be blade monsters among them. We could certainly use those where we are going.
Ranald met with his captains in the commander's house inside the keep. It was a grim enough affair with no room for luxury or refinements. Aaron's soldiers on duty here never relished the 6 seasons they would spend in the north, far away from a warm hearth and family. The place was built only for its military function. When all the men were present, the king informed them that he had set the date for their departure. The last of his forces were coming up the coastal way from the south. His scouts had reported that morning that the pass was open still, though there had been late snows in Genesis. Each captain should see to the provision and preparation of his men. The host would depart 3 days hence, on the 6th day of Greenswell. Within 3 days after that, they should be encamped at the Tower Lake. Much of the apprehension they had felt in Arois had faded 2 days into the march north. The weather was pleasant, and they walked through the beautiful countryside on the shoreline that seemed as yet untouched by war. It was only when they passed a dwelling or hamlet that they were reminded, by its desolation, of the scourge that had traveled here before them. By noon of the second day, Haldred no longer languished among the morbid thoughts that had overcome her in Arois. The paralyzing melancholy retreated somewhat in the green swell sunshine. There were growing things and blooms all about them, testifying of new life and new beginnings. Why should it be any different for these poor battered refugees? They would escape the horror and make a new beginning somewhere far from war and greed. The long column halted for a meal 16 miles short of Varus, by a brook flowing through tree-dotted fields. They spread out quickly, looking for shade, and sagged down gratefully on the banks of the stream. There were no fires now. Each one had something prepared from the night before. Sending up columns of smoke in broad daylight would only invite unwelcome attention. Haldred was tempted to wander off a little, seeking solitude. Her vigilant companions made sure she stayed within sight. The cool dark among the trees was a refuge from the weary road. Little flowers grew in profusion along the water's edge in riots of yellow, white, and blue. Insects hummed about in the still air. She removed her shoes and sat down on the flat stone to dangle her tired feet in the water. Soon enough Cura would bring her something from their cart. There would be a few moments for reflection. It was odd how her mind drifted to that night in the palace garden of Breck. She saw again the undisguised malice on the young man's face as he tried with all his might to pierce the body of his opponent. Even now she marveled at such strong emotion. He had to have been very sure of the other's guilt. And then Rune's cool manner, as if there had been no contest, shattered by the vicious accusations, the fierce hate. That had pierced his impenetrable armor. If she had not spoken, that young man would have perished that night, and he really would have become a kinslayer. Something in the undergrowth brought her back to reality. There was a strange sound, loud and urgent, like the squealing of a pig. She glanced back at where Maris and Cura prepared the meal. They'd stopped their activity and were staring in her direction, or at something behind her.
Princess Haldred.
Cura's voice floated to her from 20 yards away, painfully apprehensive. Haldred twisted her body to look behind her. A scream erupted from the girl, and Maris shouted a warning at the same time. He dropped the bread he had in his hands and made a frantic grab for his unbuckled short sword. 2 figures, 3, 4, moved out of the undergrowth. The shapes that haunted her nightmares since Sprain's Point advanced out of the green, their black eyes fixed on her. More were pressing their way through the trees. Haldred got to her feet in a dream. She was vaguely aware of screams further down the brookside. There was no thought but the rising certainty of painful death looming ahead. Her eyes could not tear away from those mesmerizing animal stares. There were more across the stream, closing in behind her, wading through the shallow water. She was surrounded. The fangs and claws made a circle of horror about her. Why did they wait? A clear, compelling thought made her look about for a weapon, a rock, a broken branch. The noise of war flared up about her. At once the creatures let out their high-pitched screeches and rushed in. She screamed and screamed, all thought of resistance deserting her in an instant. There were too many, they were too strong, too horrible to withstand soberly. This was where she would fall, trampled and torn by the swarm she had attempted to destroy. A clawed hand gripped her arm. She felt the strong nails pierce her skin. Then there was astonishment as the grip relaxed, and the nonsensical dangling of her severed forearm, before it fell away from her to the dust at her feet. In a ridiculous moment, she wondered where her shoes were. Then the darkness took her. was evening. There was a homely smell of wood-smoke fires and baking bread. Haldred opened her eyes to the brilliant stars above. For a fleeting moment she was convinced that she had died. She heard voices speaking in low tones, but that signified nothing, since all her companions were most probably also dead. The last survivors had been devoured by the swarm. Even as she felt the stinging disappointment of having failed after such tremendous ordeals, it seemed that being dead was not as dismal as she had imagined. She stirred her arms and legs to make sure her body was real. It was then that she realized that she was still very much alive. A searing pain spread from her left forearm to the shoulder, bringing tears to her eyes. She remembered the claws digging into her arm, the shrill cries of the beasts all around her. Somehow she had been saved. Quickly she checked for missing fingers or scars on her face. Apart from the arm that had been roughly bandaged, nothing seemed amiss. She raised herself on her right elbow and looked over the huddled figures round the fire. One of them had to be Cura. Haldred found that she was ragingly thirsty. The bending form of the girl was wringing out a wet cloth in a large bowl. The sound of the water inflamed her thirst. Then she noticed the low moaning from the figure Cura was tending. As soon as the wet cloth touched his brow, the man emitted an inhuman sound, from which she knew instinctively that he was gravely hurt. With her own injury tended, Haldred decided not to disturb the ministrations of the girl. She would find her own water. She rose to her feet quietly, so as not to draw attention to herself. The sudden movement caused the stars to tilt crazily, and she had to sit down on their haunches. Cura turned her head. She whispered urgently,
Princess, please do not move around. I will see to you in a moment.
Haldred heard the distress in her voice. Tears were not far off. She replied without hesitation,
Nonsense. I am not an invalid. I will help you.
She rose up again, slower this time, and approached on unsteady legs.
Who is it that you are tending?
A sob broke from the kneeling girl. She dropped the rag in the bowl and covered her face in her hands.
Oh, mistress, I know not how to help him.
The firelight played over a familiar face, her faithful Maris. He it was that had saved her from the claws, only to fall victim to them himself. She looked down at the unconscious figure, already feverish. Blood oozed through the torn sheets tied round his upper body. His bare arms were covered in untended lacerations. His face was pale, and beads of sweat were pooling in the little hollow beneath his chin.
What happened to him?
Cura forced her sobs to subside. She spoke haltingly at first, but soon a torrent of words poured from her, painting the grisly picture of the nightmare that had overtaken them that afternoon. Maris had rushed to Haldred's aid as soon as he was able. His charge had taken the swarmlings by surprise, concentrating as they were on their victim. His initial blows placed several out of action, and the rest recoiled from the ferocity of the attack. They soon recovered. He was surrounded, cut off from the rest. Before help could arrive, one of the beasts had thrust the horrible spear arm through his body. He had the presence of mind to strike at his assailant's arm, severing it instantly, but the damage was done. The loss of blood soon weakened him. He had trouble breathing. Only the timely arrival of Melvor and 4 others saved his life.
For now, at least.
She sniffed.
And he's getting worse. There's a fever and the moaning. Oh!
She placed a hand over her mouth and regarded Haldred suddenly with such horror that the latter became concerned.
What is it?
Cura looked at her through her tears. Her bottom lip quivered as she spoke.
I have not told you the worst.
Haldred grew cold.
Arid. No.
The girl shook her head.
We lost more than a dozen people. There were attacks all along the column, with much fighting. The captain and his men fought them off, but not before.
Haldred felt like shaking her.
Who is it? The king, your father. Is he dead?
A small nod was the only reply. The poor man, she thought. He could not escape it in the end. That he had been born for this hour of tragedy like she was like they all were. She noticed tears and brushed them away. If there were a tomorrow, she would find the opportunity to grieve.
And my mother?
Cura seemed relieved that she had spoken and not fainted. What a sorry sight she had to be.
The queen was not harmed. She's tending some of the wounded.
Rewen tending the wounded peasants, thought Haldred. That would be a sight. She sagged down, suddenly off balance. The grass was cool beneath her fingers. Cura reached over to put a hand on her shoulder.
I am so sorry.
Haldred tried to smile at her. Instead, a great sob unintentionally broke from her. Next to them, the wounded body that was Maris convulsed as he fought for breath. The night seemed to have no end. Haldred hovered between concern for the wounded youth and the cavern of her own loss that threatened to swallow her entirely. Childhood memories of Tregoran rose unbidden to her conscious mind, and she had no way to suppress them. She had become a spectator in the arena of her own emotions, following every whim of the unknown ringmaster, steering inevitably towards the horrific climax she could not face. In a quiet moment, Cura looked at her arm, removing the loose bandage and cleaning the cuts underneath. These were not as severe as she had surmised, certainly not as bad as the burning pain suggested. Yet the girl's lack of knowledge and experience caused her great discomfort, leading her to instruct Cura from the little she knew about such matters. Whether the pain made her seem too harsh and abrupt, or whether they were all simply too exhausted and distressed, she had the poor girl in tears again before long. Help arrived in the form of Assar the merchant. He brought with him an old woman from Breck who knew some medicine, and a water-skin she accepted gratefully. They saw to Maris immediately. Haldred watched them anxiously, trying to gauge from their expressions the seriousness of the youth's condition. There was a lot of sympathetic clicking of the tongue, much frowning and whispered deliberations, but in the end the patient was breathing easier, and the physicians declared that he would live. So great was the relief she felt that Haldred found herself fighting the sobs once more. They mistook her reaction for suffering, and she had to submit to a further examination and treatment of her wounds. This time it was properly done, and she was glad of it in the end. As the old one tore the cloth and tied the ends together at her wrist, Haldred noticed the poor woman's hands were shaking with fatigue. Each one was struggling through the ordeal of that interminable night. She managed to whisper her thanks before the two figures moved on to aid someone else. Cura gave her a blanket, and she lay down right there next to Maris. In the east the sky was already beginning to brighten. Throughout the hours of darkness, the long columns marched with resolute purpose, drawing ever closer to the Viran border. Around them, the silent lands offered no protest or resistance, for the watchmen no longer kept vigil, and the bones of the protectors already lay scattered on the field of battle. Only the stare of the twin star, that men called Lauren's eyes, regarded their steady progress with interest. For Malik the Ageless, it was a march of triumph. He alone had remained powerful. Of all the ancients, throughout the long ages of Myril, had kept his purpose without wavering, unshackled by the moralizing and traitorous emotions of others. Now came the harvest of all his steadfast sacrifice, the meticulous care he took in preparing for this hour. No one stood before him but the weak remnants of a deceived people. Kale cowered somewhere in the north, chased from his island fortress like a hare before the hounds. The great Veer sat sulking in his mountain, his pathetic pride preventing him from aiding those who had disowned him. Elena remained his willing dupe, a slave to the hurt of rejection that poisoned her, and the slow guilt that consumed her. There were no others left, unless one counted the madman Janos, who crawled around the crypts in that stinking city in the marshes. And what if Aaron had beaten off the Southlanders? He could have his forces in that land within a 10-day, once Belruth had been turned to rubble. All the fine soldiers of that boy Ranald's realm would be so much carrion for the Loctii to feed on. The paling horizon signaled the end of the night march. The signal was given to make camp. They were only 10 miles short of Nuria. The long journey was coming to an end. Ekan Sear reported before sunrise, bowing low in his Phesian manner, glibly respectful.
Welcome, my lord, to the devastated north. I sincerely hope there remains something for this fine host to conquer.
Malik ignored the boast.
You are as good as your word, Ekan. You are of use to me. Those who serve me well have their reward assured.
My lord is wise and gracious. May it please him to hear tidings of the former lords of this realm.
Speak on.
Just north of your position is the site of Turik and Fengor's demise.
A smile of satisfaction spread across his face.
It appears they were at odds with their respective forces, facing each other at Store. At that moment the swarm arrived unannounced and caught them unprepared. Only the Prince of Nuria and a dozen or so of his men escaped the slaughter.
Malik nodded. This had fallen out better than he could have planned. The irony of it almost made him laugh. The great fool Fengor had tried to rob his neighbor, only to be robbed himself. His high-stakes gamble had failed utterly, and he had paid the price for it.
What of the city?
Ekan purred his reply.
It has been overrun, like all the other cities to the south. We received our intelligence regarding the battle from 1 or 2 survivors crawling out of the rubble. We questioned them thoroughly before dispatching them. The poor sods believed at first we were coming to their rescue. No one in the north has an inkling that you ordered the preparation of this scourge.
Ekan's eyes were gleaming. The mask of humble servitude had slipped a little. He pulled it back into place.
But I impose on your rest, Great One.
He bowed low once more.
If there are no more pressing questions, please allow me to take my leave.
Malik was not fooled by this display, but he enjoyed it nonetheless. He waved a hand imperiously, and the bandit bowed himself from the tent. Three messengers arrived later that morning, and a fourth in the afternoon. The tidings they brought, though not distressing, soured the mood of the master just a little, as ever it was, with results less resounding than expected. The first and second were from his scouting parties in eastern and western Ligerium. It appeared that the swarm had not made a clean sweep of the Middle Lands, as had been predicted. There were still men in Nemona on the edge of the woods, Ligerians in control of the city. Pernacum to the west also remained intact. These were slight annoyances that could easily be dealt with, but it did not bode well for the supposed destruction of the northern cities. The third man brought much more disturbing news. He had crossed over in haste from Aaron, sent by Rost. The band Cale called his army had aided the Aaronites in defeating the invasion of their kingdom from south and north. It appeared that there could be an alliance in the making. Rost warned that the reckless young king might throw in his lot with Cale. This meant that an Aaronite force could try to interfere in the annihilation of Nuria. Such an action could prove to be more than just an irritation, futile though it would be in the end. The last messenger came from the scouts that had crossed over into Nuria. They had penetrated as far as Tew and were keeping a lookout on Belruth itself. The city was encompassed by swarmlings, perhaps 20,000, and apparently under a siege of some sort. Rumor had it that Lucain had been crowned king in his father's place. He was in charge of the defense. The people of Tew had fled or been wiped out. A similar fate had befallen the walled cities of Stor and Girdel. With Belruth holding out, the other large Nurian towns were probably still unscathed. Once again Lord Malik frowned at the tidings brought him. With Fingor and the Nurian host destroyed, it mattered little that the people were hiding in their homes, waiting for death to find them. Yet the swarm had not been as devastating as it ought to have been. He summoned Hekan for an explanation. This time he did not even allow him to touch the ground with his forehead.
You emptied my coffers of gold in the Lysan War, paying for the loyalty of your men. You emptied my lands of slaves and vagrants to feed the swarm in the waste. Did I spend all those resources for you to fall short?
Hekan was visibly taken aback. My lord? Malik narrowed his eyes.
You were supposed to give me 1,000 thousands. How is it that Belruth still stands?
Hekan hesitated. He knew half-truths would never satisfy the master of deception. It was best to state the stark truth.
There were enemy agents at work at Frane's Point. One of the larger caverns was infiltrated and the entire crop spoiled.
He cleared his throat nervously.
That does leave us with fewer of the vermin to deal with.
Malik did not allow the irritation to show in his face. His thoughts had turned to other means for opening the gates of Belruth to his host.
We may still remedy your blundering.
Something Hekan had said that morning now suggested an alternative to force. He smiled to himself. There was one more opportunity to play the savior to the fools in Viron. In the meantime, he would send Hekan to deal with Nimona and march the main host to Pernacum himself, even if that meant a slight delay in his plans. They were ready to march again. No one wanted to linger in the open road where they were so exposed to sudden attack. There could well be more swarmlings in the vicinity, and their forces seemed inadequate for protection. It was best to gain the city walls of Varus as soon as possible. Aldred gathered their few belongings from the campsite. Maris appeared to be sleeping. The fever that had plagued him all night had abated. She and Cura, with Asar's help, lifted the wounded man into a clever contraption the merchant had fashioned for them out of 2 hand carts. On a good road, such as they would be traveling, they could wheel him along in relative comfort. They let his head rest on their bags and covered him against the sun. Although the weather was cool, there would be little shade along the way, and they did not want to add to his pain. As they placed the last things around him, she remembered the difficult encounter with her mother that morning. Rewin had been sitting next to the shallow grave of the former king, her face gray and lifeless. If she had flaws in her makeup, and many said she had, one of them was not a lack of devotion towards her husband. Now that he no longer was, all the vitality, all the purpose seemed to have left her frame. Aldred had placed a hand on the drooping shoulder, feeling the shudder of grief at her silent touch. She, who had been a queen once, sat with unbrushed hair and unwashed hands, unattended and forlorn, next to the heap of dirt into which her husband had disappeared. Aldred had not been able to find anything comforting to say. Cura touched her healthy arm.
Mistress?
She was staring, motionless. With an effort, she focused her eyes on the face in front of her.
Yes, they are forming up. We have to go.
The girl motioned towards the road. People were drifting onto it in 2s or 3s. The little conversation there was muted. Together they pulled the double cart in the direction of the column. It was surprisingly easy, perhaps because there was a slight incline helping them. There were no curious stares as they joined the others, no greetings or inquiries. Each one seemed to be busy with his own hurt. They moved off with Melvor in the lead. He had sent scouts just ahead of the column to warn them of imminent attacks. The carelessness of the night before would not be repeated. Even so, the refugees scanned every copse, every shrub-lined gorge they passed with care, half expecting an ambush to materialize. Aldred could hardly keep her eyes on the cart and the wheels out of bumps or ruts in the road. She stumbled once or twice, drawing a concerned look from Cura. On occasion, she imagined a shadowy figure watching them pass by from behind a tall stone off to the side. She gasped out loud, bringing a hand up to her mouth. The cart swung to the side as only one of them was pulling and came to a halt. Again there was a look from Cura.
Princess Haldred, is something the matter?
Whatever had caught her attention was no longer visible, if ever it had been. She bit her lip, forcing her hands to stop trembling and her voice not to betray her unreasonable fear.
I'm fine.
But she knew she was not. Every shadow held danger for her now, and she felt the apprehension rising in her when she could not see round a bend in the road. More and more she thought on that dark cavern in Frame's Point, the still figures in the dark water turning over slowly at times as they expired. Only when she saw them now, they were still horribly alive, crawling out of the slimy water, their thin lips curled back round the flesh-eater fangs. That night she hardly slept. Pretending that her arm was giving her too much pain, she sat close to the fire, starting at every noise in the dark, making sure the guards were walking about and vigilant. She kept Maris' sword with her now, drawing at least some comfort from the heavy, solid steel in her hand. Relieved though she was to see the sun rising, Haldred felt worn out and depressed. They would reach Varus that day, she told herself. There she would be safe. There she would be able to sleep again. Even if the sea ravens were waiting to enslave them, it would be infinitely better than to remain within reach of the swarm. Maris was awake now, which was surely a good sign. They fed him some watery soup and made him comfortable for the last leg of the journey. Soon, however, Haldred would rather have had him unconscious still. Though he did not complain, whenever they went through a bump in the road, he made a little pleading noise from the sudden stab of pain. It was a constant reminder of the suffering they caused him. She told herself that he would feel nothing if only he was not awake. By noon they reached the city. Malvor's scouts came out to meet them, reporting no enemies in sight, and the people of the city expecting them. These last numbered more than 100, swelling the ranks of the refugee column significantly. The captain lost no time in pressing the able-bodied into service as guards and soldiers. A discreet watch would be kept on the walls and in the harbor. A series of hideouts were selected for use in case of another Sea Raven raid, and the defense of the wall, though almost impossible with so few, was laid out for each man. What remained of the swarm would not be allowed to infiltrate without a fight. The survivors of Varus were visibly disturbed by the news of their king's death. They had expected him to march in at the head of the column, bringing them the safety and salvation for which they prayed so ardently. Tregoran had spent much time in the city. Here he was still a popular figure. Now the sight of his devastated queen was almost too much to bear. The women came to pay their respects and went away sobbing. Each declared to her neighbor that she hardly recognized the queen, she being altered so much. Haldred, on the other hand, was an inspiring sight. Tales soon spread of her encounters and adventures in the desert lands, of how she had escaped the bandit lord and done grievous damage to the scourge itself. Wherever she and Arid went, there were smiles and admiration. She smiled mechanically in return, oddly thinking of that strong woman they so esteemed as someone else. All she desired was to find a place with 4 walls and a stout door she could lock behind her. Perhaps then the overwhelming anxiety would abate. She did sleep that night and well into the morning, waking to a noon sun and an empty room. Cura would be off looking after Maris, she realized. The hunger pains reminded her that she had not eaten for a day. Seeing her refreshed and improved aspect, Malvor came over to fill her in on developments after her meal. He met her in what served as the dining hall, a converted sanctuary in Imran's temple. The palace itself had been razed to the ground and was uninhabitable. Even here the stained glass of the windows had been shattered in a wanton display of barbarism. What the looters could not carry with them, they would not allow to remain unscathed. Malvor appeared tired. There were lines on his brow she did not remember seeing there before. Perhaps she had simply not noticed. His tone matched the look.
Our men have crossed the river into Nuria. They scouted as far as Ingerval.
She realized the reason for his apparent weariness. The news had been bad.
The city was partially overrun by the swarm, worse even than here. Sea ravens stood by offshore to take what remained. It is a dead place now.
His eyes were staring into the distance, unseeing. Hope at last had deserted them.
There is no sign of Turik or the host. I fear he has met with misfortune somewhere, and the same must be true for Fengor and the Nurians. If Ingerval is gone, then surely Stor has fallen, Gerdel, even Belruth.
His voice trailed off, defeated. A heavy silence descended between them. He made an attempt.
Unless he has retreated to the fortress, where he has a hope of outlasting them. We do not know for certain.
His eyes denied this claim. She felt the cold truth flowing into her.
This is a dead end, then. Our flight stops here.
You may say that. Or it could be that the ravens no longer have an interest in the city. It seems improbable that they would simply leave you here to exist in peace, though. If they become aware of you, they will doubtless come to take a look.
She sighed, all the weight of mental fatigue and unfulfilled hopes bearing down on her again.
You're saying there's no way out for us, other than to become slaves of the pirates. There's no more Ligerium. Our country has disappeared.
As she said it, the finality of her statement became real. There was no more reason to strive. It had been futile. It was time to surrender and stop the unequal struggle. At first she felt nothing but relief. It was later that day that despondency took possession of her completely. She went to look in on Maris. The brave youth even gave her a smile, though it seemed more like a grimace of pain. What a tempestuous life he had led since serving her. For once, her returning smile was real.
I want to thank you for my life, Maris. If you ever owed anything to Vengus, surely it is now settled.
There were tears in his eyes. His voice was just a whisper, his breathing shallow.
He took me from a brothel in the docks of Eros when I had but 10 cycles. My mother had died there, and they kept me as an unpaid servant. I was not treated well.
She knew this to be a gross understatement, but she did not interrupt.
They could not refuse the son of the king anything, but he paid them for me. I do not know why. And my life changed from the hog pen to the palace, where I had a name and proper food, and he instructed me himself in letters and history. When he told me the truth of what would come, I did not have to pretend. I believed him. Perhaps that is the reason. I needed a savior, and he needed to know he was not alone. What I do for you, I am doing for him still. He told me that you believed him too.
Haldred was too overcome to reply. She clasped the torn hands that had reached out to protect her from the uncertainties of the afterlife. She was ashamed that she had ever had doubts about her brother. There was an alert in the afternoon. The lookouts in the docks had spotted sails out to sea. As soon as they heard, the people were overwhelmed with panic and near hysteria. They fled to their designated places of hiding, leaving behind telltale signs of their presence within the city. Melvor had a tremendous time trying to enforce order. The more dependable among his men cleared tables, tucked away belongings, and wiped away traces of recent activity. Gradually, the pandemonium receded. Sear came to warn Haldred. His statement almost seemed matter-of-fact when he appeared in her doorway.
It's the sea ravens. They've come back to loot some more.
She sat up straight, staring at him in shock.
So soon? Our time has come.
He frowned at her in puzzlement.
Our time? For what, dear lady?
She grabbed her shoes and pulled them on in annoyance.
To be taken, of course. We are going to the Isles of Slaves.
He shook his head.
Not today. Not you and I. We were warned. The rogues are still out to sea. Remember the plan?
She shrugged.
What is the point of hiding? We cannot survive here like rats in the sewer.
Sear looked at her as if she had lost her mind.
The point of hiding is not to be found. There is no reason to put oneself in harm's way when it can be avoided. Tomorrow may bring an unexpected outcome, Princess.
Though she was not in agreement with his reasoning, or felt in any way persuaded to his point of view, she let herself be maneuvered out of the room and down the steps to a cellar prepared for bed. It was easier to comply than to argue. She willingly surrendered the decision to the merchant. He still had an air of purpose about him, a vitality she no longer possessed. The doorway to their hideout was obscured by piles of old sacking. The man who placed it outside the door had to hide himself inside it, not a pleasant place to be for what could become a lengthy spell. The storeroom itself was small and dank. They burned a single candle for light, not having the heart to sit waiting in the dark. Prayers were offered up that the pirates would not set fire to the city again. Cramped as it was with its 20 occupants, the refuge seemed infinitely better to Haldred than the city's sewers where most of the people were hiding. At least here they were above ground and not exposed to the vermin infesting that environ, though she had already noticed something scurrying along the far wall. The hours passed by. Shadows moved in the flickering light, playing havoc with her nerves. It became difficult to breathe. The room was a cavern of pools filled with moving dead. None of the others seemed to notice. Most of them were sleeping, but she could not. There were threats all about her, and the walls were closing in. She was going to scream. There was no way of stopping it. She looked around frantically and caught Asar's eye. He looked alarmed and silently shook his head, reaching out a hand to her like a lifeline to those adrift. Her trembling fingers found it. The cry remained unuttered. Asar leaned over to her.
Try to sleep.
He whispered.
I will stay awake and keep watch for you.
Even though she knew there was little value in his offer, it reassured her. The erratic heartbeat slowed and her breathing became easier. Suddenly she was acutely embarrassed. There was really nothing to fear in the dingy little room. She was acting cowardly. What the people had to think of her. There were children in the room who did not look like they were going to scream. Arid sat quietly at her feet, his fingers twisting a piece of string. Nervously, she thought. He had seen those pools too. The time of their confinement lengthened interminably. Only once did everyone who was still awake grow apprehensive. They were able to make out shouting in the distance, or what seemed to be the distance. It was hard to tell. There were breathless moments as they waited for signs of possible discovery. But no one came to search through the pile of sacking and discover the man behind it, pull the poor ones from their hideout and drag them away into captivity. Most everyone sighed with relief when finally the all clear was given and they could breathe the free air again. For Haldred it was not a moment too soon. The trembling in her limbs had started again, so much so that her son noticed it and looked up at her with those fear-filled eyes from Hekan's tent city. She was losing her battle with the shadows. Even Arid's need for reassurance dragged at her when her mind was giving way already and the sadness drained her will. Melvor himself came to release them from the suffocating prison. He noticed their obvious distress and shared a quick look of concern with Asar. The news he bore would only add to their anxiety. 3 people had been taken by the ravens during the raid. These had foolishly declined to descend into the sewers for the duration. Now there was fear that they would give away the other survivors. All the hiding places would have to be changed. The known entrances to the underground would have to be blocked and alternatives opened up. If the Sea Ravens suspected that there were many more people hiding in the city, they would certainly return to make a more thorough search or smoke them out. This could happen if they were not satisfied with the answers given by their recent captives and resorted to torture or starvation. Haldred seemed to listen at first, but after a while he had the impression she no longer heard a word of what he was saying. She stared listlessly at the ground as if she was listening to her own sentence and had not the heart to hear the final judgment passed. Melvor felt the same hopelessness steal into him. He had to leave this place. There was nothing more he could do for these people. He came to Sear that evening in private to announce his decision. As soon as she saw him, she suspected something of what was to follow. It would be one more omen, one more setback in a long series to deliver them to their ultimate doom. It was strangely difficult to focus on what he told her.
Princess Haldred, I mentioned before my desire to set off for Nuria, to render what aid I can to my people.
She nodded mechanically, her suspicion confirmed.
Yes, I remember.
There is little else I could do for you. If there was a way of escape to the north, I would assist you across the Darkweed to Ingerval, but that place is not even as secure as this one. It would be better for you to wait out the storm right here. Foraging parties will have to go out to bring in food supplies, but that can be done under cover of darkness. The fate of everyone here will be decided ultimately in the north. If there is victory there, you will be delivered in time. If there is not, well, all of us will be subjected or destroyed. What contribution I can make will have to be made there.
He waited a few moments to see if she understood him. There were tears of resignation in her eyes. He felt like a traitor deserting the refugees to their fate. There was no doubt that he was doing the right thing, but it seemed so cowardly right then.
You understand why I have to go.
I understand.
You have Asar here still. He will oversee and organize the defense.
He cleared his throat uncomfortably.
Just hold on for a season or so. Help will come eventually.
His words lacked conviction, and they both knew it. Aldred finally noticed the tears, but did nothing to prevent their passage. He prepared to depart.
I'm sorry to leave you like this. I cannot stay in the city with you, hiding while Nuria is on fire.
She nodded dumbly, her eyes dull and expressionless, defeated. He turned to go, pity choking him, but her voice reached him just before he stepped through the doorway.
Thank you, Malvor. You are a true man, faithful. I shall never forget you, and all you have done for us, for me.
It was the first time, he thought, that she addressed him without the title of captain attached. He nodded quickly and was gone. Cura was the tearful one the next day. At first Haldred thought that Maris had taken a turn for the worse, but a careful inquiry revealed the true reason for the girl's anxiety. The hopelessness of their situation, combined with the latest fears regarding the captives taken, was taking hold.
Everyone says the pirates beat them and threatened them. Surely they will give us all away. Perhaps tomorrow they will return to fetch us also.
She stared at Haldred with wide eyes.
I have heard what these beasts do to young women.
Haldred needed no reminding. She knew well that pretty girls were often sold to brothels and houses of ill repute. The luckier ones were picked out by raven lords for themselves. Would she end up back in such a compromised position? What would happen to her son? Could it be that she would have been better off in Hekan's house? She smiled at such a thought. Cura mistook her meaning.
Princess, I would die rather than be forced to do that.
Haldred had no hope to offer.
That may be all that is left us, to die here, in the ruins.
Even as she said it, and felt the now familiar surge of despair wash over her, Haldred rebelled against the thought. There had to be a way out, some route of escape, however dangerous, that offered at least a chance of a getaway. If she could but clear her head of all the aching sorrow, find a place to consider the options thoroughly. She would pray, not to the gods of Ligerium's temples, so openly displayed in their weakness and spite, to whom so many calumnious requests had been made with no result, but to the power, the providence that had brought her from the dragon's mouth, had preserved her life thus far, and had now, irrational or no, become her only glimmer of hope. At supper that evening she noticed already the effects of her change of heart. In the afternoon, walking among the burnt remains of the summer palace, she had poured out all the fear and pain, the anguish of her fate, to the blue above, where surely some echo of her sorrows were known and appreciated. Now the suffocating sense of inevitability had retreated, to leave her free to speculate once more. She watched the people of different nations, united in their peril, bound together by hardship, looking to one another for comfort, for assurance of a tomorrow where they would once again be able to taste the infinite pleasure of the ordinary lives they had despised before. It was a sight both encouraging and liberating. She had helped them to this place. She could help them to flee the greed and violence devouring their world. Sear came over to sit with her. His face wore the usual expression of respectful patronizing, as if he had the answers to all the questions she had not the courage to ask. What did he know that she did not? Had he planned to end up in a place like this, after his carefully constructed scheme in Breck? She suddenly looked at him with new interest.
You are not overly anxious about our situation.
Sear regarded her for a few moments before replying.
We are not in such bad shape, Princess, that we should be in desperation. We are safe from the swarm. We are out of Hekan and Lord Malik's path. We still have most of our limbs.
He glanced at her bandaged arm and winked. She shook her head at his jesting. He became suddenly serious.
We are almost there, Princess Haldred. Almost there. This is the route I picked for my escape from the dangers all around us now, for me and my friends. Only one more leap, and we will be safe.
She regarded him skeptically.
And where will we leap to?
He put on his familiar cunning smile.
Up the coast, beyond Esrith Point to Eston. There are supplies hidden for us in the sea caves, and a guide to take us to the hand.
Her eyes widened with incredulity. A painful hope glowed in her.
You are not making this up, are you? You are not saying this just to make me take heart again?
He looked genuinely offended.
Dear lady, I might have taken liberties with the truth in certain hard-fought transactions in Lysan, but never, ever have I embellished the facts when it came to a person of your superior quality.
Her eyes begged him that this was really the case. There was nothing in her memory to contradict his statement.
We will be safe in Argot's hand. Why would the Vadran welcome us there?
He thrust his chest out proudly as a hand went up to his feathered hat.
Because I am one of their agents, of course. Who do you think warned me of all that was about to happen in the south? I watched the city of Breck for them, and for other lords whose names I would rather not mention.
The flicker of hope he had kindled inside her flared into a blaze.
How do we get past Ingerbal? We have not the strength to fight through the swarmlings.
We do not go on foot, my lady. We take ship. It is fortunate that the greater part of our company came from the docks of Arruis. I imagine that more than a few know how to handle a fishing boat.
There are ships here to carry everybody.
Oh, we will not use ships, even if we could find them. There are the boats scattered about all along the shore. These will serve us better, I believe.
Aldred felt her pulse quicken.
When can we leave?
He did not hesitate.
I would suggest as soon as possible, before the Sea Ravens decide to return at any rate.
She had made up her mind.
Let's gather everyone together. We will put the choice before them whether they come with us or stay here. I doubt if any would choose the latter.
It turned out that she was right in her assumption. With a pirate threat so close, no one regarded Varys as a haven anymore. There was hardly any hesitation when an alternative was suggested. Relief showed on all the faces. The cowering in cellars and sewers had seemed an unsustainable strategy. With the rising of the sun, there was new activity and direction among the refugees. What remained of their supplies was wrapped in bundles, barrels were filled with water and dragged down to the docks. Houses were searched for items of clothing more appropriate for the colder north where they were heading. Aldred noticed a sudden change of mood and felt to drive back the complacent despondency so prevalent before. A little of that resolve that had brought her through the horror of the tent city returned to her. Even the queen went about making her preparations, silent and stern-faced, but with a sense of purpose. As the day drew to a close, the preparations were completed. The people gathered unbidden on the broad harbor walkways, their few possessions with them, whispering excitedly. Aldred stood among them, suddenly realizing that, one way or another, these were her final hours in what remained of old Ligerium. Once she stepped off the dock, all the threads of her former life would be irrevocably unraveled. Sear made his appearance, smiling this way and that. Arrangements had been made in his quiet, efficient way. Appointed boatmen gathered their crews and passengers, congregating together in clumps of expectation. Together they waited for the red orb to slip into the sea. Shadows lengthened. Silence slowly descended over the waiting crowd. Then a low murmur started. Somewhere among the packed bodies, a tune of the temple days, sung during the darkening when Pelea's pleas would end in another cycle of banishment. The sad melody rolled out from among the cloaked figures, all the Ligerians softly joining in. Aldred found herself mouthing the words, but she had not the heart to give them a voice. In front of her burned the anguished, fierce eyes of the Nurian exile, and for the first time she understood something of the impossible loss, the unbearable pain she had seen in them. To depart from one's home, to leave behind all familiar things, all known comforts, with no hope of returning ever again. And such a fate had not been deserved, no more than hers, though she at least had had some warning. At length the hum faded, and the only sounds that remained were those of the sea-birds and the lapping waves of the inland sea. The night had settled all about them. Sear spoke quietly to the boatmen. They would lose no more time. Under cover of dark, just in case the slavers had set a lookout, The 500 survivors piled into boats they had appropriated from the beaches and docks of Varus. 22 vessels, packed to capacity, eventually set out into the night. A pilot from the city guided them up the coast, as close as they dared to the land. If there were any signs of pursuit, they would attempt to get to the shore and escape. They made good progress under a steady breeze, and Eldred thanked whoever had opened this door to them for continued assistance. In the early morning, a few clouds crept over the horizon to obscure Lauren's eyes. The little flotilla was well free of Varus and the dying lands that had been their homes.